Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 66. Are you ready to practice your Python skills some more? There's a new set of practice problems prepared for you to tackle. And this time, they're based on working with CSV files. This week on the show, David Amos is back, and he's brought another batch of PyCoders Weekly articles and projects. David shares an article about functional programming, with a focus on the filter function. The tutorial covers how to process an iterable and extract the items that satisfy a given condition, but also covers combining filter with other functional tools and compares it to coding with Pythonic tools like list comprehensions and generator expressions. We cover several other articles and projects from the Python community, including Excel, Python, and the Future of Data Science, a Bayesian analysis of Lego prices in Python. Why can't comments appear after a line continuation character? Teaching Python on the Raspberry Pi400 at the public library, a cross-platform editor designed for writing novels built with Python and Qt, and a text user interface which uses Rich as the renderer. This episode is brought to you by DigitalOcean's app platform. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, David.
Hey, Chris.
Good to have you back coming on the show and covering much more PyCoders Weekly stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
This week, got a couple real Python things, and then kind of a whole bunch of interesting stuff that's leaning toward the project area, which I'm excited about.
Yeah.
Again, stuff we kind of keep hitting things that we've talked about before, and kind of excited about that too, to kind of follow up on some topics we've touched on.
Yeah.
So what do you got first?
So my first one comes from the website InfoWorld. It's by Matt Assay, I think is how you say his last name. It's called Excel, Python, and the Future of Data Science. And I've got to put a kind of a disclaimer out there that if you go look at this article, there are a lot of ads and pop-ups. So just be aware of that. I think they only give you like one free article a month, and then you're paywalled. But it was a really thought-provoking article. So if you can get through all that, I do think it's worth it. So the article is about kind of Python or really Python versus Excel, and what the future of data science in Python might look like, or data science in general. And it starts with kind of an interesting tidbit of information that kind of seems surprising. If you think about, what if someone were to ask you, like Chris, if I were to ask you, what do you think the most widely used tool in data science is? What would you, like off the top of your head, what would you probably say?
Well, I think we might even have touched on this before, but I think it probably is still Excel.
Yeah.
It's also like one of the largest databases, which is crazy.
It's definitely one of the largest databases. I think though, when people hear the word data science, they think like a data scientist, right? Like someone who's actually doing data science.
Sure.
And they're probably like their interaction with Excel is probably at this point, I mean, I don't know this for a fact, but I would venture a guess that their interaction with Excel is something like they've been sent a spreadsheet of data and they need to extract that and get it into something else. They might be using Python, they might be using R, they might be using something else. But this is like a practicing data scientist, right?
Sure.
But Excel is being used to analyze data and gain insights from data from people who are not data scientists. And so in a sense, it's enabling non-technical people to do some data science like activities, small business owners and even large business owners that don't have a technical background. It's very easy, or very, maybe easy is not the right word, but it's very,
I don't know. In some ways, it's really available. Like it's tool
available.
That's installed on everybody's machine. I have friends that work for like a Department of Health,
right?
And that's already there, and so that's the tool that's in front of them, and they make it work. And which is kind of amazing in some ways that
Yeah.
that they can kind of twist it to do all the things that they want to do. It may not be the simplest way to do it,
Well, but there's a lot of, it's got kind of a point and clicky kind of interface for a lot of
Right.
this stuff. You can, highlight a couple of columns in a worksheet and quickly generate some kind of graph or visualization, or, look at your data in a different way and start asking and potentially answering questions. So in that sense, you can say Excel is probably the most used tool in data science. And this article kind of interviews Peter Wang, who's the CEO of Anaconda Python. And he talks about his vision for the future of Python and the PyData ecosystem. It's not about like Python versus R or, some other language like that. In his mind, it's really about taking on Excel and how can we take the power and the tools and the open source structure of the Python data ecosystem and put it in the hands of non-technical people. So anyways, it's a really kind of fascinating look, I thought, and kind of thought-provoking about, where all this is headed and what, I guess, specifically Peter's vision for it is. I know he's not the only one that has this vision. So it is, I think, worth a read. It's not a technical article. It's not a tutorial or anything, but really was just kind of like, yeah, I mean, it's time for Python to kind of tackle this. If we want to get those tools in people's hands, this is kind of the direction we need to be heading. Otherwise, it's just going to stay, even though it's immensely popular, the Python data ecosystem, it's going to stay only in the hands of kind of the trained data scientists and those people.
Right. We keep talking about how people inside of organizations sort of develop these superpowers that other people notice them using something like Python and, like think that they have these magical skills now. Part of that is just getting that hurdle of like your Python basics book, like, getting things set up and,
right.
and going and doing your initial programs and so forth. And flattening that curve is a goal of real Python in general. Like, how can we get people in and using these tools and make things more approachable? And that's one big advantage of, like talked about Anaconda, the distribution of like a whole sort of ecosystem as opposed to it piecemeal. There's definitely different approaches on all that. So I still feel like, we can bend this curve even more. So it'll be interesting. I feel like we're there though. Like I feel like it's starting to happen just like in these little steps and so forth. Some of the other things we'll talk about today with interface tools and things like that. So yeah, cool.
What you got?
So mine is a real Python article, and it is kind of on a theme. You might remember we had Jim Anderson on in episode 27, and he was talking about preparing for an interview with Python practice problems.
Yeah.
And he, discussed the process of creating this whole thing and looking at multiple solutions. And I think the main idea was we want to give you these problems and then have you think about them. And so there's a whole sort of show hide portions of the article where you can kind of decide if you want to see the answer or if you really want to go ahead and work through it before you do your comparison with it. And this follows that structurally. In this case, the focus is on CSV files. And so it's Python practice problems, parsing CSV files. One thing that I got a little tripped up on is I was like looking for the quote unquote CSV files. But in this case, it's focused a little differently in the sense that you're starting with the concept of test-driven development. And if you're not familiar with that, this kind of takes you through some of it. It also provides a bunch of links to additional articles. Like I think we mentioned Dane Hillard had a really good one recently about test-driven development and using PyTest, which is kind of the tool that's being used here. And so instead of like full on CSV files, you're sort of mocking a lot of that up with something called a PyTest fixture. And the fixtures, we might have mentioned that term also, this idea of like pre-organized data that you're going to use, and then you can kind of predict and already know the results of, so that your tests can pass. So it's a very different approach on the practice problem theme. Not only are you getting to work with how can I easily parse CSV files using tools that are built into Python, but then there's like 4 sort of scenarios that you're going to get a chance to kind of practice. That's funny because we're building off of an Excel article, right?
Yeah.
You can export your Excel stuff into CSV and be right along here. So
Yeah.
the first problem that's described is parsing football scores. This would be the world definition of football, of soccer versus the American-centric one. And you're writing a program that's going to take the file name on a command line and then process the contents of the CSV. The program's going to determine which team had the smallest goal differential. So like between goals that team scored versus that were scored upon it. And so those two numbers are like subtracted, and they're taking kind of the overall value to see, which team had the smallest one, so that they were closest together, those own goals versus goals against them. So it's kind of interesting, just kind of the math there isn't super complex, but you are still going to need to go through and kind of parse things line by line and so forth. So I'm not going to spoil it because you should work through these problems. And then in there, you're getting the problem solution that the Real Python team went through. And the next one is about weather data, really popular at this moment because everything's just crazy heat wave. The two of us are still kind of on the western part of the US and we're sweltering away here. That one is about taking the average days, high and low temperature, and comparing them. Your program should determine which day had the highest average temperature. So that one, you're kind of working with just a slightly different set of data and kind of going through it. Then you do a refactoring, figuring out how to make all these things a little more efficient by maybe reusing a lot of the CSV parsing that you were doing, which is structurally something you should eventually kind of think about. You might come up with a simple solution initially, but now you're going to kind of come back and then think about, okay, well, how could I have a solution that can reuse parts across multiple other things? And then the last one is, instead of using some of the built-in Python CSV tools, you're going to do CSV parsing with pandas. We've had actually a bunch of really interesting courses come out based around pandas lately. And so I'll provide links to those if you're looking for some additional skills to work on. And one was the gradebook project recently came out. And that one has a lot of really kind of fun tools that you're learning to practice and use there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's another version of what we were talking about before of let's practice your Python, and here we're giving you a bunch of things for you to get a chance, and then you can kind of reveal these solutions as you go along and check how you did.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really neat format. I think it's not a tutorial. I mean, I guess you could kind of consider the solutions in some sense, because Jim does, explain the solutions, which is kind of funny that, it's a rare thing on Real Python where the bulk of the text in this article is hidden. When you first,
it looks small.
First look at it, it looks small, and then you open the solution box, and it's got a full explanation in it, and walks you through everything. And some of them have multiple solutions for you to look at. But it's a really neat format, and I think that you hear people talk about this idea of getting stuck in tutorials, and I think that there's a need in general for different kinds of content, that it's, and, that goes beyond the tutorial to like, okay, this is giving you a chance to, here's a problem, you can practice it, and then you can compare notes with one or two solutions that we've come up with that are fully explained. You're actually getting to do something yourself. So it's, it's a really neat format. I really like it. I think Jim does a great job with these. Like you said, it's the second one he's done at this point. I hope that we'll have more coming down the pipeline.
Yeah. It's funny. I have a question for you. Do you, when you approach a tutorial or like maybe a book that's filled with these types of projects that they're kind of walking you through step by step, do you ever try to go off in advance and try to do the thing before you read the explanation? Do you ever attempt that on your own?
Like if I'm actually reading a tutorial?
Yeah. And you're like, oh, I see what they're going to try to do here. Let me see if I can hack it out myself.
Actually, I don't think I've ever really done that. Usually if I'm following a tutorial, I'm just going through it kind of step by step and following along. I have done quite a bit where like you get done with the tutorial and then it's like, okay, what could I do to kind of like build on this? Where could I take this?
Yeah.
But no, that's interesting. I don't know what that says about me, but no, I haven't really done that.
I've recently started to do that just occasionally, like I'm like, okay, I see what they're trying to do. Like I see a pattern that this author has and they like to do this. And I'm like, I think they're going to try to do this again. So I'm going to go try to work ahead and see if I can kind of solve it a little bit. And I'm not going deep far ahead because I may not have the domain knowledge, but I can kind of like start to suss some of it out.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think your solution for like kind of making a tutorial a little fresher of like, all right, well, how can you expand or expound upon this thing of that you're created is kind of interesting. And then, like my idea of like going ahead. The other one that I've done that has been interesting is if it's like a video tutorial, often I will watch all of it, maybe because I'm in a different circumstance,
Yeah.
I'm on a treadmill or something or whatever, and so forth. And so I try to keep all of it in my head.
Yeah.
And then try to go do it.
Oh, yeah. I've done that a lot. Yeah. Where like you read something or watch something and you don't necessarily follow along exactly like with it, and then you go back and you try to recreate that. Yeah. I've done that. I have done that a lot. And actually in the Python Basics book, we actually have some exercises in some chapters that like every section has exercises. More like there's like a couple of rare sections that don't have exercises, but there are a couple of sections where you kind of like build something, and one of the exercises is to go back and try to rebuild it without looking at anything in the chapter.
Nice.
And just see like what you've retained, and if you don't remember something, try to do it, like try to solve it on your own. And so that's a really great learning technique. I like that.
Yeah. So there's a lot of ways you could kind of not make it be so step by step is I guess what I'm trying to imply. If you're afraid of like, letting go for a minute and trying some of this stuff out, there's a handful of techniques that somebody could kind of try to expand upon their step by step tutorial habit.
Yeah.
DigitalOcean's app platform is a new platform as a service solution to build modern cloud-native apps. With App Platform, you can build, deploy, and scale apps and static websites quickly and easily. Simply point to your GitHub repository and let App Platform do all the heavy lifting related to infrastructure. Get started on DigitalOcean's App Platform for free at do.co/realpython. That's do.co/realpython. Well, what do you got next?
Next one I've got comes from Austin Rockford, I believe, or maybe it's Rochford. I'm not sure.
Okay.
So it's a fun article called A Bayesian Analysis of Lego Prices with Python with PyMC3.
It's perfect for you.
I don't know how much we've talked about my Lego obsession on this.
Anybody who follows you on Twitter
if
know.
anyone follows me on Twitter, they've seen me post like the my builds and stuff. So this immediately caught my attention. It's math and stats and Lego and Python. So it's like perfect,
right?
Yeah, confluence of things that I enjoy. It's a really interesting article. So and it's actually a second in a series of posts that he has written analyzing Lego pricing data scraped from the website brickset.com. And in the first post, he gives like an empirical analysis of whether or not a Lego set, in particular, it's a Star Wars set, like whether or not it's a fair price. Because when he was looking at it to order it, it was like $70, and it's not a big set. It's 663 pieces, which for a Lego set is not massive. And he thought, wow, that seems a bit steep. So he tried to answer this question, like what is a fair price for this? So he's got this kind of empirical analysis that he's done. And then in this article, he does a much more statistical analysis. And it is very technical. And he does some explanation of some of the math that's going on, but not a lot. So it is assumed that you have, kind of a stats background, but it's full of code and really walking through a Bayesian analysis of something, which is really, really neat. And it also uses an interesting project called MC3, which we featured in PyCoders. We haven't talked about it on the podcast. It is a tool for doing probabilistic programming in Python. So they describe it as it allows you to write down models using an intuitive syntax to describe a data generating process. It's just kind of neat. That was the first time, I found this project and was like, this looks really cool. And, I've thought about probabilistic programming in the past. I'd never done much of it, but it was neat to see a Python package. And this was the first time that I came across an article or a project that was actually using it. So I thought that was kind of neat. It's a really cool article. Like I said, I really like finding these examples of kind of an end-to-end analysis. Mm-hmm. So you kind of get a sense for what is this person, what is their thought process? How are they thinking about tackling this problem? What kinds of things are they looking at? Do they shift, do they find something that surprises them that sort of, shifts some kind of hypothesis and they, have to kind of change the way they're approaching it, things like that. And yeah, so this is just a really, really nice walkthrough of an end-to-end analysis of whether or not this particular Lego set is fairly priced. And what's interesting is he's looking at a Star Wars set. And I think anyone who has purchased Lego, like official Lego, realizes or knows that the not sponsored, but what's the word? The sets that are
licensed,
the Disney licensed. Thank you. That's the word I'm looking for. The licensed sets are generally more expensive than the non-licensed sets, and so
yeah, it was like Harry Potter, Star Wars.
If you look at it on a brick by brick comparison, you might be paying several cents more for, a small brick in a licensed set than that same brick would cost in a non-licensed set. So there's kind of just interesting factors that you have to take into account with all of this. And so, yeah, it's just a really fun article. It's got lots of cool examples of plots, and, there's lots of scatter plots and talking about, how he's using those scatter plots, which I think is another kind of neat thing. You see a lot of tutorials that are here's how you, make a scatter plot in Matplotlib or Seaborn or whatever, or here's how you, look at it, how you generate a histogram. But unless you've taken a statistics course, or even not just a statistics course, but more of a, mathematical modeling course or things like that, it's not always clear how you're supposed to actually use those plots. Or
lay out the axes and
so it's a fun article. And yeah, if you like stats and you like Lego and you like Python, you'll probably like the article.
You'll be down for this one.
Yeah,
cool. All right, well, my next one's a real short one, and it built on one that we covered last time. We were talking about Black and Łukasz Longa's recent little blog post he had that was about the sad face dedent.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's very much related to that, in a sense that how Black is formatting things within brackets. Again, it could be parentheses, squares, or curly or whatever, but the idea that they're kind of given line by line and so forth. And so this is a Stack Overflow question thread, and it starts with, why can't comments appear after a line continuation character? If you're not familiar with a line continuation character, it's as you're writing something in Python, if you are needing to, I don't know, this whole line is going to go past, so let's say you've set up your editor at it should wrap at 80, I think is common, but I think even under that might be more common, characters across. And so you might decide, all right, at this point is where I feel like it should break. And so you'd put a slash to indicate that. And so this person was like, well, if I put a slash there, kind of maybe a little earlier, I also might want to put a comment. And Python doesn't allow for that. It can't parse that. There's really not anything you should put after the line break. And so the most popular solution that kind of came up was, well, you should probably, if you want to try to do something like this, you want to go line by line, breaking something down, similar to how we were just talking about it was done inside of Black. In that case, then you probably should go ahead and put things in a pair of parentheses. And in that case, you kind of white space again doesn't matter, which is really nice. And you can actually just drop in comments with a hashtag inside there to normal inline comments that you would use in Python. You could put them right inside, and it's pretty slick. And it again, some of the advantages of doing it that way, follow from that other article. The sort of the consistency, the readability, sort of the developer efficiency, which we mentioned, like the idea of minimizing diffs. And you probably have seen things like this before. Like I think we mentioned that, not only can it be the arguments or the values in a list, or, making out the items in a dictionary or what have you, that you're kind of breaking them line by line. But one of the other ones that that kind of is related is, we've been talking about pandas a lot off and on here, the idea of like chaining commands, which is something that I used to practice a lot with R, that has this pipe kind of operator thing that would allow you to like take one process and then the result of that do this and then do this. And inside pandas, you can do a lot of that with just a dot and continue on. And that would be a really common place where you'd want to drop a note, like, what are you doing here with this next step? It's like, okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sort, and then I'm going to sum, and then I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this. And then instead of those being like all separate, kind of messy looking calls one after another, you could have it sort of stacked up and have the dots all in alignment. And it's a pretty slick way to do it. And I definitely been seeing that more often. But the problem is, if you want to accomplish that, you probably, if you're going to, break things out line by line like that, you would use, again, parentheses to kind of sort of make that a whole block of code together.
Right. It's a technique that I think gets overlooked in a lot of like tutorials and a lot of, when you're learning Python, this, using parentheses. It's a different kind of use of parentheses. It's basically creating like a block where kind of everything in that block is sort of, you can move things around the way you want. You can put things on different lines. And at the end, it's basically just going to, snap everything together. And
sort of suck all the white space out.
Right. Yeah. In a sense, like that's one way to think about it. And it also works for strings, which is where I've used the two most common places that I've used this is like in pandas, when you have to chain a bunch of methods together on like a data frame. And then also when I want to write like a paragraph of text in my code that doesn't fit on a single line. And I don't want, you could use like the triple quoted strings, which you see for like doc strings, but those preserve white space. So you have to be like, if you get to the end of the line, you hit enter. Well, that new line character is in there. Like it's in any indentation you do, like it just preserves all the white space in the string. So if you want to not preserve the white space, you want it to be one continuous string, you can do this. And it's like an implicit concatenation, basically. You don't have to use the concatenation operator, things like that. So yeah, it's a really neat technique, something to be aware of, and it can really help make your code look a little bit nicer.
Yeah, the readability is like a huge factor of it, I think.
Exactly.
Especially if you're gonna chain things, chain object methods, or you're gonna, like you said, do something with text, or you want to have comments next to items and so forth. It gets parsed in a different way, which is great. So what do you got next?
Next one I've got is another Real Python article from our good friend Leodanis Pozo Ramos, probably at this point the most prolific Real Python author
He's super
of all
prolific,
time.
Yes.
And this one's called Python's filter, extract values from iterable. So this is all about the filter function, which is one of the built-in functions in Python. And it's a very in-depth, thorough discussion on what filter is. So I think I know we've talked about in the past.
We did map.
Yeah. And I know we've talked about like functional programming style. So this kind of falls into, there's like this map, filter, reduce sort of like trio of functions. And we've got the reduce one, I believe that one has been published. Yeah, we've got the one for reduce, we've got the one for map, and now we have the one for filter. So we've got that trio covered. And it's a similar, I guess, structure to the other ones. You get introduction to kind of what the functional style is, and understanding like what a filtering problem is. So let's say you've got a list of numbers and you want to extract from that list only the positive numbers or only the even numbers, or I don't know, numbers that are prime or multiple of 3 or something like that. It's very common. This is a very, very common problem. The numbers example is also common, but this shows up in many, many different ways. You need to filter some kind of list or some kind of sequence or iterable on some kind of condition. So filter is one way to do that. And you get a full walkthrough of, how you use filter to solve those kinds of problems. But then there's also a discussion of combining filter with other tools. So you get to see how kind of map and filter can work together, how you can combine filter with reduce. And there's also a discussion of a different kind of filter function from the Iterables module called filter false, which is kind of doing like the inverse of the filter function.
Okay.
So the filter is like, I'm going to pull out all the elements of some iterable for which something is true, and filter false does the opposite. It pulls out all the elements in an iterable for which something is false. So that is a variant on that. You get to see that. And then there's a discussion about Pythonic style. And, should you always use filter? I mean, you can. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. But you can also achieve the same thing in a lot of cases with a list comprehension. And, you can argue one way or the other. Is that more readable? Is it less readable? List comprehensions in general are one of those things that could be very confusing for beginners, especially if you don't come from, like, say, a more mathematical background. For me, when I first saw a list comprehension, it was like, this looks exactly like set builder notation that we use in mathematics all the time. And so it was very easy for me to wrap my head around that because I'd seen a very similar style and a very similar structure and had already gotten over the learning curve for that. But yeah, so it just talks about, the difference between those two styles and how you would rewrite some of the things you've seen in filter using list comprehensions, things like generator expressions, which is like a generator comprehension in a way, and things like that. So yeah, like I said, it's very thorough, kind of covers all the bases. And, map, filter, reduce, it's one of those things. It's not specific to Python. You see these functions with the exact same names in many different programming languages.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those things that at some point you want to be familiar with this stuff just to know that it exists and when sometimes it might be better to use something like that.
It makes me think about this course that we'll have coming out soon about inner functions.
Oh, yeah.
The idea that Python is sort of a jack of all trades type of language. It's trying to do all these different things, or at least allowing you to have access to them. So, one of them is obviously, as we've discussed now, functional programming. You can approach Python in that way if you want. You can approach it with all these kind of different ways of, like, what makes sense. Do you want to do object oriented? Do you want to do functional, or do you want to do these other different styles? Which I think is powerful. It can be a little confusing because there are so many options.
Yeah,
but I think that's kind of a unique kind of powerful thing about Python, and something that I did not understand initially. Like I felt like it was very easy to to be lured into one area or another, and not realize that these are people that are coming from Java and they really want it to be like this, and these are people that are coming from this and they really want it to be like that. It's
right.
Like, hey kid, come over here, check this out. You're like, okay.
Yeah.
And so suddenly you're like in a different camp of style, which is interesting.
Exactly. And it does kind of seem, it like some of this stuff kind of goes against like the Zen of Python. There's one that says something like, there should be one and preferably only one way to do something. And you look at something like filter or map, and it's like, well, I can do these multiple ways, at least two.
Yeah.
Replace it with a list comprehension or something like that. But at the same time, it's just the nature of languages, to be completely honest, right? Like they're going to grow over time as more and more people use them. They're coming from different backgrounds, and it's true of not just programming languages, but also human language. It's just a natural thing. But it's something like map reduce filter. It's like it's sort of like this iconic thing that you find in so many different languages that it just makes sense to have it in Python.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It covers the types of things a Python developer should know when starting to work with JavaScript. It's titled Python versus JavaScript for Python developers. The course is based on an article by Bartosz Jaczynski, and in the course, Christopher Trudeau takes you through where JavaScript comes from and where it's used, how JavaScript's type system is different from Python's, how to write functions in JavaScript, and the two ways of creating objects in JavaScript, JavaScript's general language syntax, along with surprises and behaviors in JavaScript that Python programmers wouldn't expect. I think it's a worthy investment of your time to learn how to navigate the differences between two of the most popular programming languages. If you want to share your Python code and projects with others, it's highly likely you want to do that over the internet. And it would be helpful to be prepared for what you can expect when working with JavaScript. All Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections, and where needed, include code examples for the techniques shown. The lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find the link in the show notes, or you can find it using the newly enhanced search tool on realpython.com. My next one is kind of taking off from a project I had mentioned, I don't know, probably more than 6 months ago. And it was about the Raspberry Pi400, this sort of packaged version of the Raspberry Pi that is sort of a keyboard with all the ports right on the back of it. So you can just plug it into an HDMI monitor or a television if you want. It kind of reminds me of the Commodore 64 or some of the early computers that I had,
right,
where I just attached it to a TV, which, seems like ages ago. But I think the computer itself is around $70 US.
Something like that, yeah.
But this guy, Don Watkins, he's listed as a correspondent for this site, opensource.com. And he has two different articles that I kind of wanted to touch on. The first is, I guess the core one is called How Do I Teach Python on the Raspberry Pi 400 at the public library? And I'll touch on that a little bit more, but one that was associated with what was his review of the Raspberry Pi 400. And he was reviewing it as the $100 package. So it came with like an SD card, came with a mouse, came with a power supply, came with like kind of all the things you need. And then I think one of the most interesting things that it comes with is it has a manual. And he pointed that out. And I was like, yeah, you buy a Mac today or you buy a PC today and there's no book. I mean, it's like literally like, maybe like some kind of like warnings or other like little minor things that maybe needed to be required to be included. But I remember getting manuals with computers, and that's something that I think is vastly useful in certain circumstances, especially something like this, where it's an inexpensive computer and you might be using it in a circumstance where the person maybe has never had a computer. Or, I just talked to Marlene Mangami in the last episode, and we were talking about, how in Zimbabwe, she's trying to set up these classroom situations and so forth. And I thought about this computer, and we had talked about books and the idea of like giving a kid who may not be able to take the computer home. They may not, have a monitor. They may not have all these other tools, but maybe they could take home the documentation and they could read more about it. And in this case, it's more than a manual. It's like, it has projects and other kinds of places to explore. So it's this sort of like documentation that seems to be missing in so many things these days that I think is kind of neat that's included in that way. So anyway, I like that review of it. And then his review also kind of really focused a lot on, hey, can I set this thing up to be with a webcam and get it to be, something where like remote learning could be used also, based upon the last year of school and so forth. And so he finally did get like a Logitech webcam to work with it. And most video conferencing stuff, after a little bit of wrangling, he was able to get them going. The one exception was Zoom, which is interesting. I don't know if that's a limitation of the version of Linux But anyway, he was able to get like Google, is it Meet now? I always get the names wrong, but anyway,
Yeah.
and a couple other ones that were out there. So that's a neat review of it. And then the focus of the teaching it at the public library is that he had been wanting to get back to teaching, really, after the last year, and wanted to figure out a way to kind of give back and get back to teaching actual Python in sort of situation like that. So he was able to work with a library in New York and get them, and a kind of a community-based group to kind of get a little bit of funding, and they were able to buy like 5 of the computers and then some inexpensive monitors. And I was just trying to look at like how much like a simple VGA flat screen monitor is, and it's unfortunately close to the price of the computer, but generally, like around $80 to maybe $120, depending on the size you want. But anyway, that's something that could be, reused. And again, if you have a Raspberry Pi, you can plug it into pretty much anything with an HDMI connection, and you got a display for it. So most TVs today, his goal is to really just get people working with it. And so he's, it's a fairly short article, but he really liked the idea of like how easy this was to kind of get going and set up. He talks about using it with the Mu Python editor, which I know that we've talked about in circumstances with Sean and Kelly, the Teaching Python podcast, and they're sort of fans of that editor too. It's very popular for, things like Circuit Python, which I'm going to be focusing on soon. And then he mentioned a couple books that he was able to get: Teach Your Kids to Code and Python for Kids. And so then, what's really cool is, he was able to work with like the Turtle module and get them going. I know that's something that we have not only a good article on, but a nice video course inside there. And at the end of it, you're creating a little game, which is pretty fun for kids to kind of get them going. So it's a neat set of articles. I've had a couple of people reach out and wonder, what are other resources that we have that, can help people get into the, not only, teaching of Python, but some of the resources that are available to kind of get set up on their own to replicate something like this. And, it's a fairly inexpensive footprint, for the price of like a modern Macintosh computer. You could get 5 of these computers and their monitors and
right.
And they come with books and all that sort of stuff. And for teaching Python, it doesn't need to be this overt large set of things. It's like the goal is more, I don't know. I think about that sometimes, like, like if the computer is kind of more centric toward doing, programming and that sort of stuff, like, could that be less of a distraction? Not saying that you can't, go on the web and so forth with these computers. I'm just saying it's less of the focus in some ways.
Right. Yeah.
So,
these, I mean, it doesn't even come with the screen. It only comes with a keyboard.
Yeah.
So like, it's definitely not like, the idea is not that you're going to like consume content on this device. It's clearly more for like creating or learning. But it's just one of the things that struck me when I read this article was that he being Don, the author, had been wanting to do this, this community class at the library, and then we had the pandemic, and he's in New York, and I think things got really, really. It says he's from Franklinville, which I don't know where that is, but New York got hit really hard there early on in the
they did.
in the pandemic here in the U.S. and things got locked down, and he really wanted to get back to this, and I think he mentions in the article that he had been searching for someone to kind of sponsor this and help pay for some of this stuff, but in the end he was able to just kind of self-fund it. Like he was able to just buy these computers for the people that wanted to take the class. The barrier to entry is in some ways, or at least the financial barrier to entry to all this stuff is in some ways I think the lowest it's ever been in the history of
it's kind of
computing.
amazing.
And it's just really incredible what you can do. And from the perspective of someone who's teaching, that even he was able to just fund it himself. Like that is just kind of mind blowing to me. It's like, hey, I'm going to have this class of students, and you know what? I'm just going to buy them all computers. And it wasn't that long ago that would be a lot of money. And now he was, it made it affordable and within his reach to even just donate and contribute to that. So that's really amazing. And yeah, I'm with you. I think that if you're just learning Python, you don't need a MacBook Pro. You don't need the latest whatever.
Right.
You can use just an old laptop with Linux on it. And the beauty of Python being open source, now the open source operating systems and everything. I mean, it's just kind of mind boggling. I mean, I remember when my family got our first computer, and I remember it was a privilege to have a computer at that time.
Yeah.
And I remember even, past that, going to the computer shop, like we would go get it repaired, and I'd go into the computer shop and look at the computers they had in there. And, it was like these computers, the Raspberry Pi400 is probably more powerful than those computers. And those computers were like $2,000.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember just thinking like, man, would it be so cool to have something like that? But it's so much money. Like we'll never have anything like that. Now it's like, $70 computer.
Yeah, it's the price of,
powerful
a family going out to dinner or what have you, like depending on where you go.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing. Yeah. Well, that kind of was leading us into projects as we went, sort of building on top of it. So what's your project for this week?
Mine is this really cool project that actually Dan Bader found, and he was the one that sent it into the PyCoders, as something that we should talk about. I took a look at it. I've not actually played around with it, but it just is a really cool little project. It's called novelWriter. It's a plain text editor designed for writing novels, assembled from many smaller text documents. It's got a minimal formatting syntax inspired by Markdown. It allows you to add metadata for comments, a synopsis, and like cross-referencing things. And this is, again, one of those projects where it's not so much like, I think you should use this, as much as like, man, go check out this repository. It's Python. They're using the Qt 5 GUI framework. So if you're looking for a good example of a GUI program in Python, like this is something to go check out. It's got a lot of cool little features, and they've also got the repository has been set up. It's got tests. They're using, I don't know if it's Circle CI, but it's got continuous integration. It's got the packaging stuff. It's got a setup.py and setup.cfg file. So it really and code coverage as well on the testing side, so you can see how much of the code is actually being executed when you run your tests. So it's really kind of the full thing. Like if you want to see a modern example of a GUI application in Python, it's a really cool repo to check out.
Nice.
Yeah.
So mine is building off of a project that we mentioned a couple times, which is called Rich. It's from Will McGugan. We had a post back in February, or one of the other things we were talking about, of a group of people taking Rich, and again, it's a library for rich text and colors and formatting inside of the terminal. And in February, this group, and he wrote about it in his own blog, they built a terminal dashboard using Rich. And that one was for it was showing like GitHub in real time, using it to kind of render it out. He was very intrigued by these people doing that. And so he kind of went and started focusing on it. And after that, he just announced his own version of that. It's called Textual.
Yeah.
And it's a text user interface, a TUI, TUI, and it's built with Rich as the renderer underneath it. And it's pretty slick what he's built. And he gives a nice demo of the dashboard and sort of what's happening. And he has added hover, mouse hover focus and scrolling across these separate windows, key bindings so that you could type a key and one of the textual little windows will pop in or pop out, appearing and disappearing inside of like a larger layout. So you could kind of like dismiss something or, check another area and so forth.
Yeah.
And then he's also been focusing on just really getting that scrolling right and like indicators and things like that. So it's neat to see this text-based UI sort of expand upon it. I expect to see more what we would have called command line interface tools start to maybe use this as a way to kind of expand on it and give you a little more of a UI than just simply text coming into it. And one thing I wanted to mention is that I was looking at Rich and the repo for that, and I got to near the bottom of it, and this is something I'm going to be talking about a little bit more. Rich is used by so many different tools, just because people really like what it can do as far as making the terminal experience a little more enjoyable, and the whole there's this whole realm of REPL replacements, which I know you've been working on, that use tools like Rich underneath it. So it's become kind of one of these very useful tools across the board. And it's actually part of the TideLift subscription for enterprise. And so he talks a little bit about that. And I recently spoke to some people from TideLift, and I'm hoping to have them on the show soon, kind of explain what's going on there. And again, that is one of these focuses not only on funding of open source and keeping open source going, but also kind of a security thing, which I'm also talking to Dustin Ingram really soon to talk about his talk at PyCon, and sort of like, what do you need to be aware of as a developer as far as security, and also as a Python user. And I feel like the TideLift thing kind of builds on top of that too. So it's going to be a fun set of conversations, kind of building on all those ideas to pay attention. But it's funny, like how much open source it builds on top of the shoulders of these other packages and so forth. And Rich is definitely in there, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with textual if it gets the same kind of embrace.
Yeah, it's I'm just looking at it now. It's the used by on the GitHub repository. If you scroll down a little bit on the right hand side, you see used by, and it's 3,800. 3,800 other repositories list Rich as a dependency. So it's quite a lot, and it's an interesting topic. I mean, I'm curious to hear the conversation you have with Dustin and everything, because it's one of these things where open source is not just people building passion projects or hobby projects. I mean, Python is a classic example, right? I mean, the Python language is open source. It has been since the beginning, and yet it's a critical piece of infrastructure for many, many enterprise products. So it's just an important topic of, and like the TideLift, the, supporting people, and, the GitHub sponsorships that they have now, all this stuff is a real need.
Yeah.
Especially like something like Rich even now is probably being used by some stuff where, if something breaks, I mean, he's getting potentially some very angry emails and things from people that it's like, their livelihoods depend on this thing working. Yeah, so I'm very curious to hear about what Dustin has to say about all this stuff, if that's what you guys end up talking about.
That's part of it. Yeah, part of it is like just the security structures and stuff that we focused on a couple times on the show. So also the name squatting stuff, and a couple other articles we've talked about. But we also talk about just the idea of dependencies and in that. And then the TideLift one, I think, will be really interesting too, because I feel like it's an answer, definitely for enterprise.
Yeah.
And if that helps the entire ecosystem, then I think that will be amazing. And so, we've asked like, oh, how can people give back, and how, can you get your company to be involved in giving back? Because there's so many organizations that use all these tools. And so,
right.
It's it's an interesting time, not only for security, but for ongoing support and keeping open source going, but also finding ways to get those maintainers funds and support in kind of different ways too, not only just monetary. So
yeah. Well, good stuff.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun stuff this week. I just ordered my Raspberry Pi400 this morning, so I'll report back on that. I ordered the one that does come with the book,
cool,
and all that sort of stuff. The other ones where you got to like buy a little case and, like potentially a little fan and all these things that go in. And I'm like, man, I really like it to be in just all in one package.
Yeah.
I kind of like that design, even, because like it's not that much bigger than finding a keyboard for it. Most of the keyboards that I have that came with like PCs and stuff like that have, like 101 key with the number keypad and everything. Yeah. And I think this thing might actually be slightly smaller in some ways.
Yeah.
So, well, thanks for coming on the show and bringing all these articles again.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right. Talk to you soon.
See you, Chris.
And don't forget, you can get started on DigitalOcean's app platform for free at do.co/realpython. That's do.co/realpython. I want to thank David Amos for joining me again this week. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.